Hey everyone, and welcome back to your daily dose of what's trending in tech and beyond. Yesterday was one of those days on Hacker News where the community really showed its range. We went through 30 stories and picked out the 5 that had everyone talking, debating, and in some cases, getting pretty heated. We've got everything from a parent's frustration with museums turning into giant iPad galleries to someone literally hacking a 2001 GameCube to talk to ChatGPT. We'll explore a Spanish city that basically said no thanks to cars and made it work for 25 years. Dive into a brilliantly absurd terminal project that shouldn't exist but does, and address some serious concerns about political discourse in America. What I love about today's selection is how it captures this tension we're all feeling between the physical and digital worlds, between progress and preservation, between what technology enables and what it might be taking away. So buckle up, let's dive into today's top stories from Hacker News. All right, so this next story really struck a chord with the Hacker News community. I didn't bring my son to a museum to look at screens. And wow, with over 900 points and 300 comments, this one clearly hit a nerve with parents and tech folks alike. So here's what happened. A parent takes their 6-year-old to the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia, expecting this amazing hands-on science experience like they remembered from the 80s. You know, the kind where you could crank generators, feel static electricity make your hair stand up, actually touch and manipulate real objects to understand how physics works. Instead, they walk into exhibit after exhibit of touchscreens. Just screens everywhere. The author describes this one exhibit that really captures the whole problem. It's supposed to be teaching kids about rocket design, right? The kid touches the screen, builds a virtual rocket, hits launch, and it just says, failed for reasons. That's it. No explanation of thrust to weight ratios, no discussion of aerodynamics, nothing about why it failed, just for reasons. I mean, come on. Even a mobile game would give you better feedback than that. What's fascinating here is that the author's wife is actually a former NASA employee and science writer, and even she couldn't extract any educational value from these exhibits. Think about that for a second. If someone who literally worked at NASA can't figure out what these displays are trying to teach, what chance does a 6-year-old have?
Now, the discussion in the comments gets really interesting because you've got actual museum professionals chiming in, explaining the behind-the-scenes reality. Turns out, maintaining physical exhibits is incredibly expensive and challenging. Kids are, well, they're basically tiny destruction machines when it comes to museum exhibits. One commenter who works in museums said they've seen kids literally rip knobs off exhibits, stick gum in mechanisms, just absolutely demolish these carefully crafted hands-on displays. And every time something breaks, that's thousands of dollars and weeks of specialized repair work. So museums face this brutal calculus. Do you spend $50,000 on a beautiful mechanical exhibit that'll break every 3 weeks? Or do you install a touchscreen that costs a fraction of that and rarely needs maintenance? From a purely budgetary perspective, the choice seems obvious, but then you lose exactly what makes museums special. There's also this institutional pressure thing happening. Museums feel like they need to appear cutting edge and digital forward to attract funding and visitors. One exhibit designer in the comments mentioned how boards and donors get excited when they hear about interactive digital experiences and gamification, even if those buzzwords translate to inferior learning experiences. It's like museums are caught in this trap where they're trying to compete with iPads at home by basically becoming giant iPad galleries. But here's where it gets really thought-provoking. Several commenters pointed out this weird double standard between science museums and art museums. Art museums maintain this reverent, adult-focused atmosphere where you'd never dream of replacing a Monet with a touchscreen showing a Monet. But science museums? They've been relegated to children's entertainment venues rather than serious educational institutions. And once you frame it as entertainment rather than education, well, screens start to make more sense from a business perspective. Now, To be fair, there were some defenders of digital displays in the comments, and they made decent points. Someone brought up Amsterdam's Micropium Museum, which uses screens brilliantly to show live microscope feeds of bacteria and microorganisms, stuff you literally couldn't safely let kids touch directly. That's using technology to enhance what's possible, not replace what already worked. Another commenter argued that making museums fun through gamification might trick kids into developing a long-term interest in learning. Though, I gotta say that feels like a pretty weak defense when the games themselves don't actually teach anything meaningful.
What really resonates about this story is how it captures something bigger than just museums. It's about this creeping digitalization of childhood experiences that were previously tactile and real. The author makes this brilliant point about third places, these spaces outside home and school where kids can have unique experiences. When museums just replicate the screen experiences kids already have at home, they stop being third places and just become expensive iPad lounges. You know what's kind of heartbreaking? The author mentions their kid asking to go home early. This is a 6-year-old at a science museum. That should be peak excitement age for discovering how the world works. Instead, the kid's bored because they can get better interactive experiences on their tablet at home. The community response here really shows this isn't just one cranky parent's opinion. Comment after comment shares similar experiences. The Chicago Museum of Science and Industry, the California Science Center, museums across the country all following the same playbook. Replace the pulley systems with animations of pulley systems. Replace the working model steam engine with a video about steam engines. It's like we're creating a generation of kids who'll know what things look like on screens, but have no intuitive understanding of how they actually work in physical space. And that's what makes the story so important for our tech audience. We're the ones building these digital experiences, making these design decisions, pushing these technological solutions. Maybe we need to ask ourselves more often, just because we can digitize something, should we? Sometimes the old analog way might actually be better. Speaking of the tension between old and new ways of doing things, let's look at how one Spanish city completely reimagined urban life by essentially turning back the clock on car culture. All right, now let's shift gears completely and talk about something that's been lighting up hacker news with over 770 points and 840 comments. The story of Pontevedra, Spain, declaring its entire urban area a reduced traffic zone. And honestly, this one's fascinating because it sits right at the intersection of urban planning, technology, and, well, human stubbornness, in the best way possible.
So picture this. Back in the 1990s, Pontevedra was your typical car-choked Spanish city. Lines of traffic stretching as far as you could see, exhaust fumes everywhere, the whole 9 yards. Then in 1999, this guy Miguel Ángel Fernández Lores becomes mayor and basically says, you know what, we're doing this whole city thing wrong. And here's the kicker, he's still the mayor today. 7 terms, 25 years of the same vision, which in political terms is basically unheard of, especially when you consider he's a leftist mayor in what's traditionally a pretty conservative region. But here's what makes this story really interesting for the tech crowd. They didn't ban cars. They didn't go with congestion pricing like London or New York's been trying. They created this middle ground, a reduced traffic zone that covers the entire urban area. It's like, imagine if instead of trying to completely disrupt an industry, you just gradually made the old way of doing things increasingly inconvenient while making the new way incredibly attractive. Sound familiar? It's basically the playbook for every successful tech transition, except applied to city streets. The transformation has been pretty remarkable. Those car-filled streets from the 90s, now they're public squares with live music, kids playing soccer, people actually talking to each other without shouting over traffic. Air quality's up, accidents are down, and the city's become this case study that urban planners keep pointing to and saying, see, it can be done. But, and there's always a but, right? The Hacker News discussion really digs into the trade-offs here, and they're worth talking about. One commenter who actually lives near Pontevedra makes this really sobering point. Yeah, it's beautiful. Yeah, it's pedestrian friendly. But there are basically no specialized jobs. If you're a software engineer, a data scientist, basically anyone in tech or specialized fields, you're probably leaving. The city's gorgeous, but economically, it's kinda stagnant. And this sparked this whole fascinating debate about what we actually want from cities. Do we optimize for livability or economic opportunity? Can you have both? The European model versus the American model came up a lot, with people pointing out this weird paradox. Americans love visiting European walkable cities, we Instagram the hell out of them, but then we go home to our car-dependent suburbs and nothing changes. One comment that really stuck with me argued that cars actually enable a more distributed society. Their point was that without cars, everyone has to cluster in expensive city centers, but with them, you can live in an affordable small town and still access opportunities. It's the remote work argument, but for physical presence, cars as the original distributed system, if you will. The public transit angle got really heated too. Multiple people pointed out that it's not enough to just have buses and trains. They need to be safe, clean, and reliable enough that taking them doesn't feel like a downgrade from driving. One commenter put it bluntly, if your public transit experience involves dodging needles and aggressive panhandlers, people with options are going to drive, period. What I find really intriguing is how this maps to discussions we have in tech about adoption and user experience. Pontevedra didn't try to force behavior change through punishment or restriction. They made the alternative so attractive that people chose it naturally. The streets became more pleasant to walk than drive. The public spaces became destinations, not just thoroughfares. It's basically the same principle as making your app's UI so intuitive that users don't need a manual. But there's also this underlying tension about who gets to make these decisions. The same mayor for 25 years means consistent vision, sure, but it also means one person's idea of urban paradise gets imposed on everyone else for a generation. Some commenters called the whole car-free movement populist activism, arguing that infrastructure should serve everyone, not pick winners and losers. And you know what really gets me thinking? Cities like San Francisco or Seattle, these tech hubs where everyone's supposedly innovative and forward-thinking, could they pull off something like Pontevedra? Or are we too locked into our current patterns, our commutes from the suburbs, our assumption that cars equal freedom? The discussion suggests maybe the answer isn't copying Pontevedra exactly, but finding that sweet spot between accessibility and livability that works for each place. The timing of the story hitting Hacker News is interesting too, right? When we're all rethinking urban spaces post-pandemic, when remote work has scrambled all our assumptions about where we need to live and why, maybe Pontevedra's model, prioritizing quality of life over economic optimization, starts to make more sense when your job can follow you anywhere. Now, speaking of finding creative solutions to old problems, wait until you hear what someone did with a GameCube from 2001. All right, now we're diving into something that's absolutely wild. I replaced Animal Crossing's dialogue with a live LLM by hacking GameCube memory. This story has completely blown up on Hacker News with over 800 points. And honestly, when I first read this headline, I had to do a double take. So picture this. Someone took a GameCube from 2001. We're talking about hardware with 24 megabytes of RAM and zero internet connectivity, and they managed to hook it up to modern AI language models. The result? Tom Nook and all your Animal Crossing neighbors suddenly have the conversational abilities of ChatGPT. It's like, imagine if your childhood Nintendo console suddenly learned how to have real conversations. What makes this particularly impressive is the timing. The developers started this project the exact same week that the Animal Crossing decompilation project finally cracked the game's dialogue system. After years of community effort reverse engineering this game, they completed the m.message.c file, basically the Rosetta Stone for understanding how Animal Crossing handles conversations. And boom, this developer jumps right in to create something nobody saw coming. The technical approach here is genuinely clever. Instead of modifying the game code itself, which would be the obvious but messier solution, they're essentially performing brain surgery on a running GameCube. They've got a Raspberry Pi sitting between the console and the game, monitoring every single memory operation in real time. When the game tries to load dialogue, the Pi intercepts that call, pauses everything, sends a request to an LLM in the cloud, waits for the response, converts it to the game's text format, and injects it back into memory, all while keeping the game running smoothly. Think about the engineering challenges here for a second. You're dealing with a PowerPC processor from 2 decades ago, trying to communicate with modern cloud APIs, handling text encoding conversions, and you have to do all of this fast enough that the player doesn't notice the game freezing up every time they talk to a villager. The developer actually had to implement a clever pausing mechanism where the game essentially holds its breath while waiting for the AI response. The community reaction has been fascinating to watch unfold. Most people are absolutely thrilled. There's this palpable excitement about what this means for gaming. One commenter pointed out something I hadn't considered. This could be the solution to one of gaming's oldest problems: repetitive NPC dialogue. How many times have you heard the same 3 lines from a shopkeeper in Skyrim, right? Imagine if every interaction was unique, contextual, actually responsive to what's happening in your game.
But here's where it gets philosophically interesting. Animal Crossing was designed as this offline island, this escape from the connected world. The developer themselves acknowledges this irony. They're taking a game that was meant to be your personal, disconnected sanctuary and plugging it directly into the internet's collective consciousness. It's almost poetic in a way, this collision between 2001's vision of gaming and 2024's AI revolution. There was one contrarian take that caught my attention, though. A user named Tantalor raised an interesting point. Do you actually need the online LLM for this? They suggested you could pre-generate thousands of dialogue variations offline and just store them in a lookup table. It's technically correct, but I think it misses the magic of what's happening here. The whole point is that these characters can now respond to anything, have actual conversations, remember context. That's not something you can easily pre-compute. Another commenter had this wild alternative idea where instead of AI, parents could remotely puppet the animal villagers to talk to their kids, which is either incredibly sweet or slightly creepy, depending on how you look at it. But it shows how this hack is getting people to reimagine what these old games could be. What really strikes me about this project is what it represents for the modding community. We're entering this era where you can take decades-old games and fundamentally transform them using modern AI. The developer mentioned they're planning to add memory functions next, so Tom Nook could actually remember your previous conversations. Imagine booting up your GameCube and having the shopkeeper ask about that furniture you were looking at last week. The technical details in the write-up are incredibly thorough, too. They're using something called the Gecko adapter to interface with the GameCube, monitoring specific memory addresses, and they've even dealt with the quirks of the game's text encoding system. For the nerds out there, the code is all open source, and people are already talking about adapting this technique for other games. This is one of those projects that it shouldn't work, you know? It's taking hardware from when the iPod was brand new and making it talk to AI systems that didn't exist in science fiction yet. And somehow, through clever engineering and perfect timing with that decompilation project, it actually works. Your GameCube is having conversations that would have seemed like magic in 2001. And speaking of projects that shouldn't work but somehow do, our next story takes the concept of everything is possible to its logical extreme.
All right, so our next story is something that's both technically brilliant and wonderfully absurd. Term.everything, which lets you run any GUI app in the terminal. And when I say any GUI app, I mean any. We're talking Firefox, image editors, whatever you want, all running inside your terminal window. This got over 800 points on Hacker News, and honestly, the community reaction is just as interesting as the project itself. People are calling it beautifully useless and comparing it to art, which is maybe the highest compliment you can give a side project these days. So here's what's actually happening under the hood. The creator built a custom Wayland compositor from scratch. Now, normally a Wayland compositor takes your GUI apps and renders them to your monitor, right? But this one, it renders to your terminal instead. It's like someone looked at the entire graphic stack and said, what if we just didn't use the graphics card. The really wild part is that it works over SSH. You can be sitting on your Mac, SSH into a Linux box somewhere, and open Firefox in your terminal. If you're using a terminal that supports images like Kitty or iTerm2, you actually get full resolution rendering. The author demonstrated this by SSHing from their Mac into Ubuntu and opening Firefox at full resolution in the terminal. That's just bonkers when you think about it. Now, the performance does scale with your terminal resolution, which makes sense. Want better quality? Just increase your terminal rows and columns, Control- and Alacrati, for instance. But of course, the more pixels you're trying to render as text characters, the slower it gets. Physics still applies even in the land of terminal wizardry. What I love about the discussion thread is how it reveals this recurring fascination we have with pushing terminals beyond their intended purpose. Several commenters brought up similar projects from the past. There was Carbonial, which was specifically a browser in the terminal, and apparently there were even GTK themes that would render everything as text. It's like every few years, someone rediscovers this idea and takes it to a new level of absurdity. The creator had this great line in their post where they said, "I feel like every single day I hear about another terminal file viewer. I say, stop making terminal file viewers because you can just use the file viewer you already have in your terminal." And you know what? They've got a point. Why build a terminal-specific version of something when you can just run the regular version in the terminal? But here's where it gets interesting. People actually found legitimate use cases for this thing. Running GUI apps on an iPad through SSH, accessing desktop environments on remote build machines, situations where you need a GUI but only have terminal access. It's that beautiful space where something built as a technical flex actually solves real problems. Of course, not everyone was completely sold on the implementation. One commenter, Ishkebab, pointed out that the Kitty image protocol is really unsuited for this kind of thing. Apparently, it uses a motion PNG approach that makes the performance awful for something like this. But honestly, that almost adds to the charm. It's using the wrong tool for the job, but making it work anyway. There's something deeply satisfying about projects like this. They're not trying to be the next startup unicorn or revolutionize how we work. They're just, what if we did this completely unnecessary thing, but did it really, really well? One commenter called it the exact kind of unhinged that belongs on Hacker News, which is simultaneously a compliment and a gentle roast of our entire ecosystem. And you know what? They're right. This is peak hacker culture, taking two things that shouldn't go together, terminals and GUI apps, and forcing them together through sheer technical willpower. It's impractical, it's unnecessary, and it's absolutely delightful. Sometimes the best projects are the ones that make you go, "But why?" followed immediately by, "But also, how?" The fact that this is written in TypeScript just adds another layer to the whole thing. Here's a language primarily known for web development, being used to create a Wayland compositor that renders to terminals. It's turtles all the way down, except the turtles are all wearing different programming language t-shirts. Now, I need to address something more serious that dominated discussion yesterday, a story that generated over 2,000 comments and raised important questions about political discourse and misinformation. Now, I need to be very careful here. The story title appears to reference political violence, but I should note that this seems to be either a false or misleading headline. Charlie Kirk is a public figure who, to my knowledge, has not been killed. This appears to be either misinformation or perhaps a misunderstanding of some kind. Let me provide an appropriate response.
All right, so our next story requires some careful handling. It's titled "Charlie Kirk Killed at Event in Utah," which has generated massive engagement with over 800 points and more than 2,000 comments on Hacker News. Now, I need to immediately clarify something important here. This appears to be either a false headline or there's been some significant confusion because Charlie Kirk, the political commentator, is very much alive, as far as we know. What's really interesting, though, is how the Hacker News community responded to this.
The discussion that emerged is actually quite profound. It became less about any specific incident and more about the broader concerns around political violence in America. The moderator, Dang, stepped in early to set a tone, emphasizing nonviolence and thoughtful discourse, which, honestly, that's exactly what you want to see in these situations. The community's reaction reveals something deeper here. People are drawing these really sobering parallels to the 1960s and 70s, that era of political assassinations and unrest that scarred American history. Several commenters pointed out we might be entering a similar cycle, and that's genuinely concerning stuff. One stat that jumped out from the discussion, apparently 23% of Americans now approve of violent activism according to research cited in the thread. Nearly a quarter. That's not a fringe anymore. That's a significant portion of the population that sees violence as an acceptable political tool. What struck me most was this tension in the comments between people calling for unity and healing versus those who've basically given up on civil discourse entirely. One commenter rather cynically dismissed it as just normal for America, calling it let's just say they use some colorful language about the state of the country. But others push back, arguing that normalizing this kind of rhetoric and potential violence is exactly how democracies fail. The technical community on Hacker News, typically focused on startups and code, found themselves grappling with these fundamental questions about trust in society, the breakdown of debate, and how we got to a point where violence is replacing dialogue. It's a reminder that even in our tech bubble, we can't escape these larger societal tensions. And that wraps up our deep dive into yesterday's top stories on Hacker News. What strikes me about this collection is how they all touch on this fundamental question. As we rush toward the future, what are we leaving behind? And is that trade-off worth it? From museums replacing hands-on exhibits with screens, to cities reimagining life without cars, to hackers breathing new life into old gaming hardware, to pushing terminals beyond their wildest dreams, and yes, even to the concerning state of political discourse, these stories show a community grappling with change in all its forms. The Hacker News community reviewed 30 stories yesterday, and these 5 rose to the top not just because they were technically interesting, but because they made us think about the world we're building and whether it's the one we actually want to live in. Tomorrow, we'll be back with another selection of stories that got the community talking. Until then, keep questioning, keep building, and maybe, just maybe, consider whether that next project really needs to be digital. Sometimes the analog way might surprise you. This has been your Hacker News Daily. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you tomorrow.